Hi everyone! For our presentation this week, Mary Beth, Daniel, and I will be discussing resistance to change at the organizational, group, and individual levels. Understanding the different types can help in understanding ways to reduce resistance. Change is inevitable, and so is resistance to change. The big question is, why do people resist change? According to McCalman, Patton, and Siebert, it's quite simply because they fear the unknown and are comforted by the familiar. People fear change because they feel they are losing control, and we know no one likes feeling powerless. That's why so many people would rather avoid change because of how uncomfortable the associated feelings can be. I think we can all think back to a time when we were afraid to do something in our personal or work life because of the uncertainty and the change involved. Later on in this presentation, Daniel will discuss some methods for dealing with resistance to change. It is not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. Philip Grunner shared this quote with us last class, and it is very fitting for what we are discussing. My interpretation of it is that no company or organization, despite how big or small, is guaranteed success forever. We have seen organizations like Blockbuster at its peak, owning over 9,000 stores, having over 84,000 employees, 60 million customers, and valued as a $3 billion company. Today, Blockbuster no longer exists because they failed to change, see the future, and innovate. In other words, if organizations want to remain competitive, they need to embrace change sooner rather than later. They need to be willing to think outside the box and take action. Otherwise, they will be left behind. There are four types of organizational change that often face resistance, triggered by power and conflict, function, organizational structure, and organizational culture. Power and conflict is when there is resistance to change due to a power struggle and conflict, causing one department to be better off while harming another department. Function. There is resistance when departments don't see eye to eye on how to solve problems. It's hard to come to an agreement when it comes to change. Organizational structure. Resistance to change here because employees are fixated on their job or position and cannot adjust to changing conditions. Organizational culture. Resistance occurs here when the values and norms are disrupted by the change. And now on to Mary Beth, who will be discussing group resistance to change.
Our brains are designed to resist change, even if it's a good idea or well-intentioned. One of my favorite writers on this topic is Dr. Britt Andreatta. In her book, Wired to Resist, she explains the neuroscience behind why we resist change and looks at ways we can work with this understanding of the brain and use it to our advantage. Dr. Andreatta looks at four areas of the brain that detect and resist change. The first area is the amygdala, which is constantly scanning for threats and is in charge of our flight, fright, freeze, or flock instinct. The second area is the entorhinal cortex, which is like an internal GPS that creates a mental map for us. It looks at both spatial and social fit in our surroundings. And when changes happen in these areas, it requires the brain to work overtime. The third area is the basal ganglia, which is an area in our brain which creates habits. If we break those habits or have to create a new routine, it again requires your brain to work harder. And finally, the habenula, which releases chemicals which create positive or negative feelings that encourage us to either do something or resist something. If we think back a few hundred years ago, our brains were looking to detect danger in order to help us survive. So these four areas were very important. Although technology and culture has changed so that we no longer need to be looking for threats around every corner, our brain's evolution has not changed as quickly. So when we are looking at organizational change, these areas in the brain are helpful to keep in mind. Another important aspect of life, which started hundreds of years ago, was searching for a group in which we could belong. This belonging helped us to stay alive and, in fact, thrive. Group change is another place where change agents can encounter resistance. There are 3 types of group change, as noted by McCallum, Patton, and Seibert, that often face resistance. The first area is group norms. This occurs when there are changes to task or role interaction in the group. An example of this could be when a new CEO comes into a company. For example, Philip Gruner last weekend discussed coming into a new organization and ensuring that within the first 90 days you have a good understanding of the organization and are creating changes. Some of the changes he described were staffing changes within the organization. This could face resistance around group norms. The second area is group cohesiveness. So this is when group members want things to stay the same within the group. This reminded me of the story that Philip Gruner told us about Northlands, the company in Alberta that will be winding down and closing as of July. Philip discussed how he was a part of that board for a while, and that there was a clear distinction between the group of existing board members and some of the newer board members, and the resistance to new ideas that were brought up. There was a resistance from the existing board members within the group to the change that was coming. The final resistance to change can come from groupthink, which can include many things, but generally is a scenario where people all agree to the same decision, whether they believe in it or not. Again, this reminded me of the Northlands organization. We saw a news story last weekend from 2016 that described the 2020 vision that they had for their organization. And in that story, I could hear that there seemed to be hesitancy from city officials, but the organization was pushing forward anyways. This to me related to groupthink, where you can imagine people may say things like, well, this is the way we've always worked in the past and it's working just fine, so we're going to just keep pushing forward instead of listening to warning signs of what may be coming. Whether it be organizational, group, or individual resistance, these dynamics need to be kept top of mind whenever we are dealing with any type of change. Next, I will pass it on to Daniel, who will look at some ways to overcome resistance.
Check out this beautiful matrix that I have for you on the screen. These are approaches to deal with resistance to change. And this matrix was actually developed by Kotter and Schlesinger back in 1978, but I think it's still relevant in this day and age. So if you look at the matrix, the key here is to diagnose the types of resistance you'll encounter and tailor your countermeasures accordingly. And it all depends on the situation. Sometimes you'll need to implement change rapidly and other times not. So for example, implementing a change rapidly during a crisis situation. And in this situation, maybe you need to coerce people a little bit more. But in other situations, maybe you need to take more of a participatory approach as well. So you can see all the approaches on the left-hand side of the matrix there. Today, I'm talking more about the education and communication approach. And this is also mentioned in the change management book as well on page 32. You can see the top part to Kotter's matrix, education and communication. This is the most common method for dealing with resistance to change, and it makes sense. You explain it to the people that are being affected by it. For example, why is the change needed? What's involved? What are the implications for people in the organization? Education and communication can be done through a variety of ways. For example, one-on-one discussions. My strategy is to find out who the group influencers are and have a little chat with them. Presentations to groups is a good way. And one of my favorites is the lunch and learn. And that way I get a lunch and also I get lots of people coming to my session as well. Memos and webinars, emails, not sure. Memos, not sure how many people read those, and same for emails as well. Webinars are not too bad, and also e-learning. The education and communication part of this matrix, one of the 6 approaches that Kotter has, is a handy method when there's a lack of information or inaccurate information going around the company. And we've all been there, haven't we? Working in these types of companies sometimes. Obviously, this method is costly and time consuming. The nice thing is about this is that once people are persuaded, they can help with the implementation of the change. From my personal point of view, I think it is good to get employees involved in the process early and having honest communication with them. There also needs to be a consistent message delivered from management. Also, the message should be delivered over a long period for maximum impact. I do like the idea of using education as a method to combat resistance to change. In other words, I like Kotter's work. And also it's quite relevant now that we've reached the plateau with COVID-19 vaccinations. I was listening on CBC radio earlier today, and they were saying that the maximum number of population in Canada that will agree to get vaccinated will be around 80%, and we're getting there. But out of the 20% that are unvaccinated, or should we say hesitant to get vaccinated, they say that around 10% can be persuaded. In other words, we can change them, change their mind. So I'm looking forward to seeing the educational strategies the government will come up with to educate those that have doubts about it. The important thing for me, and I think it is for you as well, is that we look after everyone, not just the select few or those that have a so-called formal education. So being hesitant has got nothing to do with intelligence. But what's important is that everyone has access to information and trustworthy sources. So it could be a family member, it could be someone to talk to, a doctor, or anyone else. I'm looking forward to having a little bit of a chat about this with you after this video. Thanks for watching.